imagine a scenario for a moment. You're driving your car across a newly constructed, state-of-the-art concrete pedestrian bridge.
Right.
And below you is an 8-lane highway. Now, you trust that the bridge is holding up because you trust the raw, uncompromising laws of physics, right?
Yeah, you trust the math.
Exactly, you trust the math. But what if the engineering firm that built that bridge didn't prioritize math? What if instead the internal culture of that firm prioritized, like, the emotional well-being, the ideological conformity, and the demographic diversity of its staff over mathematical rigor?
Well, according to a highly controversial new book, you actually don't have to imagine that world. You are, unfortunately, living in it.
Yeah.
And that shift from an uncompromising focus on objective reality to a focus on subjective emotional validation
Well,
is the foundational premise we're exploring today.
because we are looking at a space that is incredibly active, right? Highly motivated, and generating a tremendous amount of literature aimed at completely deconstructing the modern world.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive cultural force right now.
Yeah, right. So if you're tuning into this deep dive today, you're likely someone trying to make sense of the dizzying, just rapid shifts in modern culture.
You're watching these fierce ideological battles tear through corporate boardrooms, reshape universities, dominate the internet.
Yeah, and you want to understand the architecture of these culture wars. Specifically, you want to know what is actually driving the red-pilled manosphere, what men's rights advocates are actually reading, and, what historical and philosophical frameworks they are actively using to push back against the current mainstream narrative.
Which is exactly what we're going to unpack.
But real quick, a note before we get into the heavy lifting here. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It really helps us continue to unpack these complex, controversial ideas for you week after week.
Really does.
So bringing us to the mission for today's deep dive, we are undertaking a comprehensive review of a newly released, highly provocative ebook. It's called Dictatorship of Truth: Rejecting Female Narratives to Reclaim Western Glory.
By Conrad Riker.
Right, by Conrad Riker. And let me tell you, this book is functioning as a heavy intellectual armory for its target audience.
It's basically a radical blueprint designed specifically for men seeking to understand the history of Western institutions before, in Riker's words, they were captured by feminists and Marxists.
Yeah. And if you want to explore these uncensored arguments firsthand, and we strongly encourage you to do so to fully grasp the sheer scope of his claims, you need to buy this ebook. It's available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Yeah, go pick up a copy of Dictatorship of Truth.
And to keep up with the author's ongoing arguments, you should follow him at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Because reading the primary source material yourself is crucial, especially with a text this polarizing. It allows you to see how the arguments are constructed from the ground up, rather than just hearing secondhand summaries.
Absolutely. And because this text contains highly charged political and cultural content, we need to explicitly lay down the ground rules for today.
Good idea.
We want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides. Our mission today is to impartially report on the content provided in the book.
Right, we are not endorsing Riker's viewpoints.
No, not at all. But we are going to rigorously convey the ideas and arguments exactly as they are laid out in the original source material. We want you to understand the ideological architecture of this movement.
We are mapping the territory, and to do that, we are going to trace Riker's argument from its very foundation. We'll start with his philosophical defense of classical logic in what he calls an epistemological war.
Right.
From there, we'll unpack how he applies that philosophy to modern institutional decay, like why he believes our corporate and physical infrastructure is rotting. Then we'll examine his views on how this ideological shift has subverted the family and modern relationships.
And finally, we will dive into the psychology of what he calls the red-pilled architect, leading into his actionable blueprint for building parallel societies.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. So let's start right at the bedrock. Riker argues that the entire Western world is currently suffering from a meta-crisis.
Yes.
But he doesn't diagnose the root cause as economic inequality or climate change or, political polarization. He says the crisis is epistemological.
Which is a heavy word.
It's a very heavy word. He claims we've undergone a catastrophic shift away from what he calls logos, which he defines as objective masculine logic, and replaced it with pathos, which he frames as subjective female-coded emotion. So what does he actually mean by an epistemological crisis?
Well, epistemology is simply the study of how we know what we know. It's the philosophy of truth.
Okay.
Riker argues that for thousands of years, Western civilization operated on a shared epistemology, which is that objective reality exists independent of how we feel about it.
Right, the world is what it is.
Exactly.
Okay.
For Riker, logos isn't just a rhetorical device used in a debate. It's the fundamental operating system of human progress. And to anchor this, he relies heavily on Aristotelian logic, specifically championing the law of non-contradiction.
Okay, let's make sure we ground that for a second. The law of non-contradiction is the idea that a statement cannot be both true and false at the exact same time in the exact same sense.
Right.
It seems obvious, almost like saying water is wet. Why is he putting so much weight on it?
Because he believes the modern left has completely abandoned it. Think about the physical world. If you step off a 10-story building, gravity will pull you down.
Yeah.
Gravity does not care about your lived experience. It doesn't care if you identify as something lighter than air, you're going to fall.
Right.
Riker takes that uncompromising physical reality and applies it to biology and civics. He uses biological sex as his primary example.
Okay.
He states that you are either a mammal with XY chromosomes whose body is organized to produce sperm, or you're a mammal with XX chromosomes whose body is organized to produce ova. There's no middle ground, no subjective interpretation.
So to Riker, this isn't merely a debate about modern gender politics. He is treating biology as the foundational bedrock of Western science and law.
Yes. He views the law of non-contradiction as the ultimate impenetrable firewall against the fluid, subjective reality peddled by postmodernism.
Because if you allow someone to say, I am biologically male, but I am also literally a woman.
Then Riker argues you have broken the law of non-contradiction. You've allowed a statement to be both true and false at the same time.
I use an analogy when thinking about computers that fits perfectly here. Think of the law of non-contradiction as the foundational binary code of an operating system, the ones and zeros.
Oh, that's good.
It's rigid, it's absolute. Riker is essentially arguing that once you allow a 1 or a 0 to mean whatever the user feels it should mean, the entire computer crashes.
Exactly.
It doesn't just make one program glitch. The fundamental architecture of the machine stops functioning.
That analogy hits the nail on the head, and Riker traces the moment we started messing with the ones and zeros back much further than you might think.
Yeah.
He doesn't blame TikTok or the 1960s counterculture or even early 20th century progressivism. He traces the root of this postmodern rejection of reality all the way back to the Enlightenment, specifically to the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Immanuel Kant.
Yeah.
He is widely considered one of the central figures of Enlightenment reason. How does Riker draw a straight line from Kant, a guy who wrote centuries ago, to modern leftist ideology?
It centers on a very specific critique of Kant's seminal work, the critique of pure reason. Before Kant, philosophers generally believed that our senses gave us direct, albeit sometimes flawed, access to objective reality.
Okay.
Kant completely fractured that assumption. He created a philosophical division between what he called the noumenal world and the phenomenal world.
Okay, let's break those two terms down for someone who hasn't sat in a Philosophy 101 class in a decade. What's the difference?
Sure, the noumenal world is objective reality as it actually exists in itself, completely independent of our observation. The phenomenal world is reality, purely as human beings perceive it, through our specific sensory and cognitive frameworks. Let's use an apple as an example.
Right.
You see an apple as red, round, and sweet. Kant would say that the redness and the sweetness are just how your human brain processes light waves and chemical compounds. That is the phenomenal experience.
Okay, I'm with you.
But the noumenal apple, the apple as it exists completely outside of human observation, is something you can never truly know.
So Kant basically argued that our perception is a filter, and we are permanently trapped behind that filter. We only ever experience our own minds, not the raw universe.
Exactly. Now apply that to Riker's argument. Riker acknowledges that Kant himself maintained very rigid, objective moral frameworks, but he argues that this initial philosophical division was the fatal flaw in Western thought.
How so?
By separating the objective is from the subjective experience, Riker claims Kant unwittingly handed later generations of Marxist and postmodern theorists the exact tools they needed.
Because if we can't ever truly know objective reality, then the only thing that matters is my personal perception, my lived experience.
That is the crux of it.
Yeah.
Riker argues that the modern left took Kant's phenomenal world and elevated it above the noumenal world.
They replaced it.
Yes, they replaced objective, biological, and mathematical truth with the concept of lived experience. If a person says their lived experience is that 2 + 2 = 5, or that a biological man is a woman, Riker claims the modern institutional framework validates that experience over the objective data.
Wow.
He calls this the intellectual suicide of the modern left. It creates a society that values narcissistic emotion over mathematical truth.
And he provides very specific modern examples of men he views as martyrs for this cause, right? Men who, in his eyes, simply pointed to the ones and zeros of objective reality and were subsequently destroyed by the system. Let's talk about Alessandro Strumia and James Damore, because these cases really ground his philosophical theory in recent headlines.
Right, Alessandro Strumia's case is a prime example for Riker. Strumia was a highly respected particle physicist at CERN.
Which is the European Organization for Nuclear Research. This is one of the most advanced scientific institutions on the planet.
Exactly. In 2018, Strumia gave a presentation at a workshop. He used rigorous, data-driven modeling, bibliometrics, and citation distributions to argue that the field of physics was not inherently biased against women.
What was his alternative explanation?
He argued that male and female interests and cognitive focuses naturally diverge at the extreme tails of the distribution. Essentially, he presented data suggesting that men are naturally overrepresented at both the very bottom and the very top of certain highly systematized, abstract cognitive fields.
And what was the reaction from CERN?
Oh, the blowback was massive and instantaneous. He was suspended and effectively exiled from the scientific community.
Just for presenting that data?
Yeah. Riker describes Strumia's actions as committing the unforgivable heresy of reading the data. For Riker, the Strumia incident is proof that an institution built entirely on the Enlightenment principles of reason, physics, and objective truth like CERN has been captured.
Captured by an ideology that actively punishes data if that data conflicts with an egalitarian emotional narrative.
Precisely. And the James Damore story is incredibly similar.
Right. Damore was the Google engineer who wrote a memo challenging Google's ideological echo chamber. And again, he wasn't writing a manifesto of hatred. I remember reading the memo when it came out.
Me too.
He cited massive data sets from evolutionary psychology to explain why there might naturally be fewer women in certain high-stress, highly systematized tech roles.
Damore relied on the well-documented psychological framework of the Big Five personality traits, specifically noting that women, on average, score higher in trait agreeableness and tend to gravitate toward fields involving people, while men gravitate toward fields involving things.
And Riker praises this.
Oh, Riker describes Damore's memo as a flawless application of Enlightenment reason and Locke's empiricism.
And Google fired him.
Yes, Riker calls Damore the modern Socrates, condemned to drink the hemlock by a democratic mob of a female-coded corporate cult. Riker's core thesis here is that these institutions no longer seek truth. They seek emotional validation.
But I need to challenge Riker's logic here on behalf of the listener. If Aristotelian logic is so mathematically foolproof, so fundamentally sound and tied to the raw reality of the universe, how does Riker explain why it is supposedly losing so badly?
That's a great question.
Right. If Logos is the ultimate weapon, why does he feel the West is collapsing? It seems contradictory to say, we have the ultimate truth, but we are being completely defeated by subjective emotion.
Well, that's the natural next question, and it moves us directly into Riker's broader societal diagnosis. Riker doesn't believe logic itself is failing. Gravity still works. Math still works.
Okay.
He believes that specific institutions that historically guarded and applied that logic have been deliberately infected. Logic hasn't been defeated in a fair intellectual debate. Rather, the mechanisms of institutional power have been handed over to people who actively suppress logic.
So the fortress wasn't breached, the guards just handed over the keys.
That is his perspective exactly, which introduces his concept of the ossification of evil and institutional decay.
Ossification of evil, that's a phrase.
Yeah. Riker looks back at the Roman Imperium, right? Its expansive road networks, its aqueducts that stood for millennia, its rigorous legal codes, as the ultimate historical manifestation of patriarchal pragmatism and natural hierarchy.
Rome, to him, was built on logos.
Yes. But our modern equivalent institutions, he argues, have been captured by what he dramatically labels a gynocentric death cult.
Okay, where did this capture come from? Because you don't just wake up one day and find that every major corporation, university, and media conglomerate has simultaneously abandoned objective truth. How does he trace this infection?
He points the finger directly at the Frankfurt School. They were a group of mid-20th century Marxist theorists. We're talking about thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, Herbert Marcuse, and Max Horkheimer.
For those who aren't familiar, what was the Frankfurt School's main goal?
They were trying to figure out why classical economic Marxism failed to take hold in the West.
Right, because Karl Marx predicted that the working class would become so impoverished by capitalism that they would violently overthrow the owners of production.
Exactly. But in the mid-20th century, the Western working class was doing great. They had cars, televisions, suburban homes. They were enjoying the fruits of capitalist prosperity. They had absolutely no desire to start a violent economic revolution.
So if you were a dedicated Marxist and the working class weren't revolt, what do?
According to Riker, you initiate a deliberate, tactical pivot. The Frankfurt School realized they couldn't win an economic war, so they moved to a cultural war.
A cultural war.
Yes. This is where Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony comes in. The idea is that you don't need to seize the factories if you can seize the culture. The universities, the media, the entertainment industry.
And how did they weaponize what Riker calls female-coded emotion to do this?
Well, they needed a new proletariat. Since the working class was content, they focused on marginalized groups. Riker argues they weaponized empathy and narcissistic victimhood.
Okay.
They framed every societal interaction not as a pursuit of excellence or truth, but as a dynamic of oppressor versus oppressed.
So everything becomes a power struggle based on identity.
Exactly. By demanding empathy for the perceived victim, they began their long march through the institutions. They used the language of compassion to slowly rot the foundational structures of society from the inside out.
Which brings us back to this phrase, the ossification of evil. That is a very heavy descriptive phrase. How exactly does Riker define this? It sounds like he's saying evil has changed its appearance.
He draws heavily on the philosopher Hannah Arendt here. Arendt covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust.
Right.
She coined the phrase, the banality of evil, when she observed that Eichmann wasn't some cartoonish mustache-twirling villain. He was a terrifyingly ordinary, boring bureaucrat who's just following procedures, filling out paperwork, and checking boxes.
Just doing his job.
Right. Riker takes Arendt's concept and applies it to modern corporate and academic America.
He literally writes that modern evil doesn't wear a theatrical military uniform or cackle while plotting world domination.
No.
It wears sensible shoes, works in human resources, and holds a clipboard detailing your mandatory compliance training.
For Riker, the modern manifestation of true evil is the bureaucratic ossification of incompetence. It's the diversity bureaucrat, the academic dean, the mid-level HR manager who enforce a passive-aggressive procedural tyranny.
Because these individuals don't build anything. They don't generate revenue or invent new technologies.
Exactly. Their entire purpose is to enforce diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI mandates. They prioritize these subjective quotas over raw competence and meritocracy.
You know, it reminds me of the concept of a digital panopticon.
Oh, yeah.
A panopticon is a theoretical prison design where the inmates never know exactly when the guard in the central tower is watching them, so out of fear, they end up policing their own behavior.
It's terrifying.
In Riker's view of the corporate world, the HR surveillance state isn't looking for actual crimes like embezzlement or theft. It is constantly scanning for ideological non-compliance. It's looking for any deviation from the emotional consensus.
That is precisely the chilling atmosphere Riker describes.
Yeah.
And he argues that this is merely a matter of an annoying corporate culture where you have to sit through boring seminars.
No.
He insists this shift has deadly physical consequences in the real world. When you replace engineering pragmatism with what he calls pathological altruism, physical structures break.
And he doesn't just speak in theories here. He points directly to catastrophic infrastructural failures. Let's look at the real-world examples he uses to prove that DEI policies actually kill people.
Riker is highly explicit. He points to the Florida International University pedestrian bridge collapse in 2018.
I remember that.
This was a highly publicized disaster where a newly constructed bridge collapsed onto a highway, killing several people. He highlights that the companies involved had heavily publicized their commitment to diversity and progressive hiring practices.
Oh, wow.
He argues that the focus was on the optics of the engineering team rather than the rigorous, paranate math required to safely post tension, the concrete truss of the bridge.
He also points to Boeing, which is a massive talking point right now.
Yes, Boeing is his prime corporate example. He looks at the MCAS system failure that caused 2 fatal 737 MAX crashes. For context, the MCAS was a software system designed to fix a physical aerodynamics issue caused by putting larger engines on an older plane frame. Riker argues that instead of engineering a proper physical solution, the corporate bureaucracy opted for a cheap software patch to avoid pilot retraining costs. fundamentally betraying engineering principles.
And he also points to the more recent incident where a door plug violently blew out of an Alaska Airlines flight at 16,000 feet.
He does.
And he draws a direct line from Boeing's corporate HR policies to that door plug flying off.
Yes. He argues that when an institution focuses its massive resources on internal diversity quotas, subjective emotional safety, and progressive public relations, rather than ruthless, uncompromising engineering competence, you are inevitably going to get physical disaster.
Bro.
He views these tragedies as the literal physical manifestation of pathos overriding logos. You cannot negotiate with gravity or aerodynamic pressure using empathy. When the HR department effectively dictates the priorities of the engineering department, people die.
I understand the argument, but I have to push back a little here. How does Riker differentiate between the natural, sluggish evolution of corporate bureaucracy and a deliberate, targeted Marxist conspiracy to emasculate men? Corporations have always become bloated and corrupt over time.
That's true.
Boeing's issues, for instance, are widely cited by financial analysts as a failure of prioritizing shareholder stock buybacks and quarterly profits over long-term R&D. That's capitalism functioning poorly, not necessarily Marxism. Where is the line between natural capitalist incompetence and ideological malice?
Well, Riker addresses this by arguing that the two forces have merged. For Riker, they're essentially indistinguishable at this stage. He points to the financial incentive structures themselves, specifically ESG scores, environmental, social, and governance criteria.
Right, ESG scores. That's basically a rating system used by massive global asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard to decide which companies get investment capital.
Exactly. Riker argues that these massive pools of capital are controlled by the ideological left. So even if a CEO only cares about quarterly profits and doesn't care about ideology, the system demands they adopt the language of the parasite to secure that investment money.
Ah, I see.
If Boeing doesn't hit its social diversity targets, its ESG score drops, and trillions of dollars in investment capital could be withheld.
So they have to comply.
To Riker, the corporate bureaucracy hasn't just naturally evolved to be incompetent. It's been actively colonized by a specific female-coded pathology that despises masculine accountability and enforces compliance through financial blackmail.
So the situations are captured, and the physical infrastructure is literally crumbling because of it. But Riker goes deeper than the boardroom.
Much deeper.
He argues this capture has infiltrated the most fundamental, microscopic institution of human civilization, the family.
This is a crucial pivot in his book.
Yeah.
He argues that to conquer a society, you must subvert its foundational building block. He does not view the cultural shifts of the 1960s as a liberation movement. He frames the sexual revolution as a catastrophic historical event, what he refers to as the second fall of man.
The second fall of man. I mean, to use a biblical phrase like that puts a massive theological weight on a cultural movement. Why does he use such extreme terminology?
Because he believes the sexual revolution fundamentally severed eros from logos.
Okay, define those in this context.
Eros is love, desire, and the biological reproductive drive. Logos is reason, order, and the pragmatic building of civilization.
Got it.
Historically, he argues, sex was tightly bound by the rigid institutional covenant of marriage. This covenant forced men and women into a hierarchical productive unit completely focused on raising the next generation and building surplus wealth.
This brings in the Roman concept of the paterfamilias.
Yes. In ancient Rome, the paterfamilias was the oldest living male head of the household. But Riker emphasizes that this wasn't just about tyrannical power, it was about absolute responsibility.
He had to provide.
The paterfamilias possess ultimate moral, economic, and physical authority, but he was also legally and socially responsible for the survival and prosperity of everyone under his roof. He was the anchor of the Republic.
And Riker argues that the modern state has effectively declared total war on the modern paterfamilias.
Yes.
How does the state wage war on the father? By replacing him.
Precisely. Riker argues that through the aggressive expansion of the welfare apparatus, subsidized housing, food programs, and the introduction of no-fault divorce laws, the state has seamlessly stepped in to act as a surrogate husband and provider.
Wow.
He calls this the feminist industrial complex. He claims that feminism didn't actually liberate women to be independent, sovereign actors. It merely shifted their dependence from individual patriarchal men to a massive, faceless corporate government.
And the political implication there is huge. He points out that this creates a massive subsidized voting class that is highly dependent on the state. This gives the government a permanent incentive to keep men marginalized and the family broken because a self-sufficient family doesn't need the state.
That is his core sociological argument. And he backs it up by utilizing a vast array of sociological data regarding single-mother households. He repeatedly cites statistics showing that fatherless homes correlate with drastically higher rates of childhood poverty, juvenile criminality, high school dropout rates, and broader social dysfunction.
So to Riker, dismantling male authority in the home doesn't just hurt men. It starves the entire nation of its future stability and prosperity.
Yes. And Riker also uses some intense, almost science fiction sounding biological terminology here. He refers to the widespread use of the contraceptive pill as endocrine warfare.
Endocrine warfare.
Yeah.
He takes the biological argument very seriously.
He does. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that interfere with the body's hormone systems. Riker argues that the pill was culturally designed to sever the deep psychological and biological understanding that a woman is the vessel of the future and that a man's seed carries a sacred responsibility.
So it's basically a chemical hack.
He views hormonal contraception as a chemical chain that disrupted natural human pair bonding. It tricked the body into a permanent state of pseudo-pregnancy, shutting down the natural mate selection mechanisms and replacing the sacred covenant of marriage with a hollow, hedonistic sexual marketplace.
And he believes that marketplace is perfectly, horrifyingly encapsulated by modern dating apps.
Oh, absolutely.
He absolutely excoriates platforms like Tinder and Bumble, describing them as rigged, Pareto-distributed digital harems. Let's really break down the math of what he means there, because it is central to understanding the modern manosphere's anger.
Okay, so the Pareto principle is the 80-20 rule, often used in economics. It's the idea that 80% of outcomes come from 20% of causes.
Right. For example, 80% of a country's wealth is owned by 20% of the people.
Right. Riker takes this principle and applies it to the data we actually have from modern dating apps. He claims that the algorithms and user behavior prove that 80% of women are exclusively swiping on and competing for the top 20% of men.
Just a tiny fraction of men.
Exactly. And they are doing so based almost entirely on superficial traits like height, jawline, and status, rather than the traits that make a good father or provider.
Which leaves the vast majority, the bottom 80% of average everyday men, completely invisible, touch-starved, and isolated.
Yes.
You know, I think of modern dating apps like a rigged casino.
That's a good way to put it.
You walk in, and the flashing lights promise you a chance at connection. You swipe and you swipe, hoping for a match. But the house, the app's algorithm, doesn't actually want you to find a wife.
Because if you find a wife, you delete the app.
Exactly. The app makes money by commodifying your loneliness. It keeps you engaged, strings you along with occasional breadcrumbs of attention, and then literally sells your own isolation back to you as a $30 a month premium subscription.
You're paying a corporation for the privilege of being ignored by women.
It's brilliant from a business standpoint, but devastating socially.
Riker uses almost that exact framing. He says the ultimate goal of these applications is not human connection, it's pacification.
Pacification.
A man staring at a glowing rectangle, swiping endlessly in a dark room, is a man who is completely neutralized. He's not building a business, he's not organizing politically, he's not reading philosophy, and he is certainly not challenging the state. He's biologically sedated by digital rejection.
So what does a man do?
Yeah.
If the game is rigged, what is the play? He talks about the evolutionary misfiring of the white knight.
Yeah, Riker analyzes how men attempt to cope with this rigged system. He views men who try to appease the feminist system, the male simps, or self-proclaimed male feminists, as tragic victims of their own biology.
How so?
He argues that over millions of years, men became biologically hardwired to protect and provide for women. In a brutal state of nature, that instinct ensures the survival of the species.
But in the modern world?
In the modern world, Riker says the state weaponizes that ancient protective instinct against men.
Oh.
The state forces men to pay exorbitant taxes to fund the very welfare systems that emasculate and replace them. Meanwhile, cultural messaging demands that these same men apologize for their inherent masculinity.
So the white knight instinct to protect women is hijacked, turning men into foot soldiers for their own subjugation.
Exactly. Therefore, Riker tells his readers they have only one option: walk away.
Walk away.
He advocates for men to go galt in the sexual marketplace. This is a reference to Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, where the competent producers of society realize the system is parasitical, so they completely withdraw their labor and let the world collapse.
Right.
Riker demands men delete all dating apps and completely withdraw from this rigged digital game.
But here's my fundamental pushback. Doesn't complete withdrawal just concede the territory entirely? If the historical mandate of Western man, as Riker stated earlier with his Roman examples, is to conquer, build, and expand, how does he reconcile running away and hiding from the modern dating market with that imperative to conquer? Isn't deleting the apps just admitting defeat?
It's a critical observation, and Riker anticipates this critique. He is very careful to frame this withdrawal not as a cowardly surrender, but as a tactical retreat.
A tactical retreat.
He argues you cannot conquer a corrupted system while you are simultaneously addicted to its validation. You cannot overthrow the casino while you are still desperately pulling the slot machine lever.
That makes sense.
You have to step back, break the addiction, and rebuild the self. And that psychological rebuilding is the core of the next phase in his blueprint. Psychology of the red-pilled architect.
Okay, this is where the book shifts gears dramatically. We move from diagnosing the world's macro problems to giving the individual reader very strict, almost militaristic instructions on how to behave on a daily basis.
Yes.
He says that to survive and eventually dominate, men must first violently purge a very specific psychological pathogen from their minds. The nice guy.
Riker is absolutely merciless when it comes to the nice guy syndrome. He doesn't view the stereotypical nice guy as a harmless, well-intentioned person with a quirky personality.
What does he see him as?
He identifies nice guy behavior as a deeply pathological female-coded survival strategy. He frames it, drawing on some psychological frameworks similar to Dr. Robert Glover's work, as a Marxist covert contract.
Explain the covert contract. What is the nice guy secretly demanding?
The nice guy operates on a hidden transactional logic. He believes that if he simply acts compliant, submissive, hides his true desires, and constantly apologizes for his masculinity, the universe, and specifically women, owe him unearned resources.
He believes his subservience buys him love, sex, and respect.
Yes.
But Riker argues that is biologically impossible.
Completely impossible. Riker destroys this mindset with a rigid syllogism. He states that female respect and sexual attraction are biologically predicated on male strength, the enforcement of boundaries, and visible competence.
Right.
The nice guy, however, consciously mimics weakness and vulnerability to appease the collective herd. Therefore, the nice guy inevitably provokes natural biological disgust in women and on a macro level accelerates the decay of civilizational standards.
There is a line in the text that struck me. You cannot negotiate desire with a subsidy of subservience.
It's brutal.
It is brutal, but it captures his point perfectly. So if a man successfully purges this weakness, what is he supposed to replace it with?
He must build what Riker calls an inner citadel. This is a concept borrowed directly from Stoic philosophy, specifically the writings of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius.
Okay.
Riker also heavily references the Spartan Goja, the rigorous, brutal education and training program that transforms Spartan boys into invincible warriors. Riker argues that modern societal systems shouldn't be designed to coddle men or make them comfortable.
No.
They should be designed to forge them into sovereign agents capable of bearing massive civic responsibility.
And he doesn't just leave this as abstract philosophy, he gives his readers highly specific daily mandates to achieve this Stoic ideal. One of the most fascinating to me is the 24-hour silence protocol.
Oh, that one is intense. Riker commands his readers to regularly initiate a full day of absolute silence regarding any and all grievances.
Zero complaining.
For 24 hours, you are forbidden from complaining about your life. You cannot vent to your friends, you cannot post angry political takes on social media, you cannot argue with opponents online. Absolute silence in the face of adversity.
You know, the psychology behind that is actually quite profound.
It is.
We are so neurologically wired to seek instant emotional validation by complaining. When we are frustrated, we post a rant online, people hit the like button, and we get a hit of dopamine. It feels good, but it changes nothing.
Right.
I look at Riker's silence protocol as a dopamine detox for grievance. He is essentially forcing the brain to rewire itself. If you sever the pathway to cheap emotional validation, your brain is forced into a framework of logistical problem solving.
Exactly.
If there's a massive rock blocking your path and you are forbidden from crying about it, your brain has to silently figure out the mechanics of how to use a lever to move it.
That is exactly the neurological mechanism he's targeting. And once you stop whining, you have to pivot toward actualized physical action in the real world. He references Aristotle's concept of energia being at work, actualizing your potential through action.
And what else does he mandate?
Alongside this silence, Riker dictates a strict routine he calls hora romana, or Roman time. This means waking up hours before dawn. Yeah, the psychological purpose is to claim the day, to do your reading, lifting, and building before the chaotic world can impose its subjective narrative on you.
He also dictates a very strict intellectual diet. He commands his readers to completely ban algorithmic junk food and postmodern interpretations of history. He insists they consume only primary sources.
Yes, he demands they read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the theological works of Thomas Aquinas, the scientific treatises of Isaac Newton.
Going straight to the source.
He argues that reading a modern academic's interpretation of history is consuming poison, because that academic is viewing history through a Marxist lens of oppression.
So what's the alternative?
You have to read the original words of the patriarchal titans who built the modern world. You have to download their operating system directly to armor your mind against what he calls NPC's zombie dogmas.
To illustrate the sheer power of this armored mind in a real-world setting, Riker provides a really vivid anecdote about a dinner party. We need to dissect that scene because it perfectly encapsulates his ultimate goal for men: absolute frame control.
It's a highly revealing story. Riker describes a scene where a man who embodies this red-pilled archetype is at a dinner party in an affluent, gentrified metropolitan neighborhood.
Okay, picture the scene.
A female guest, a vocal feminist, is dominating the conversation. She's complaining about the patriarchy and passionately citing the widely repeated statistic that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes.
And what are the other men doing?
Riker notes that the other men at the table are shrinking back, terrified of disagreeing and being targeted by the social mob.
They are exhibiting their exact nice guy subservience we just talked about. They are prioritizing social harmony over the truth.
Exactly. But the protagonist of Riker's story doesn't shrink. However, he also doesn't get angry. He doesn't argue emotionally.
What does he do?
He simply waits for the woman to run out of breath, calmly takes a sip of his whiskey, and states a single, statistically irrefutable fact. He explains to the table that when economists control for basic variables like total hours worked per week, specific occupational choices, risk factors, and continuous uninterrupted time in the workforce, the wage gap vanishes entirely. He goes a step further and points out that unmarried, childless women in their 20s in major cities actually out-earn their male peers.
And the reaction from the woman is explosive.
According to Riker, the woman instantly loses her temper. Because her argument was rooted in pathos, emotion, and victimhood, she's completely unable to process the introduction of logos.
Right.
She descends into ad hominem attacks, screaming and calling him names. But the man maintains absolute frame control. He doesn't raise his voice, he doesn't flinch, he just lets her emotional storm crash against his stoic wall.
And the fascinating part is the psychological effect this has on the rest of the room. The herd mentality shifts.
Yes. Riker notes that the other guests subconsciously recognize the man's unshakable, unapologetic authority. Even if they verbally agree with the woman to save face, the visceral energy of the room shifts. The herd inherently defers to the man's sovereign calm.
That's fascinating.
He didn't just win a debate, he forced reality to recenter around his logic simply by refusing to be moved by her emotion.
It is a powerful illustration of his philosophy, but this brings up another massive logistical question for me.
Okay.
Riker is telling men to completely sever their need for institutional validation. He tells them to stop seeking degrees from captured universities, to walk away from corporate HR environments, and to stop trying to please the establishment.
Right.
But in the real world, credentials dictate capital. You need the university degree to get the job at the engineering firm. You need the corporate track record to get the bank loan to build your own business. By telling men to abandon these institutions, isn't he asking them to walk a nearly impossible financial tightrope?
It is an enormous risk. Riker does not sugarcoat the difficulty of this path, but he argues that the legacy institutions are fundamentally unreformable and ultimately terminal.
So they're going down anyway.
Think back to the Boeing and Bridge examples. If you stay on a sinking ship just because the captain currently holds all the gold, you are still going to drown.
The tightrope is dangerous, but staying in a collapsing system is fatal.
Exactly. This is precisely why he demands that men not just quietly rebuild themselves in the woods as isolated hermits, they must actively coordinate to build new parallel systems.
Which brings us to the final, most ambitious section of the book. Speaking new realities, or the neo-response.
The neo-response. This is Riker's ultimate systemic solution.
He's saying, okay, you've withdrawn your consent from the dating apps, you've built your inner citadel with Aristotle and silence, you stopped being a nice guy, now what do we actually build?
Now you build a city of God.
Another theological reference.
Right. Riker leans on the theological concept outlined by St. Augustine. Augustine contrasted the corrupted, decaying city of man with the eternal, truth-oriented city of God.
And how does he translate that into the 21st century?
He translates this into modern logistics. He argues that rational men must geographically, financially, and psychologically withdraw their consent from the corrupted city of man, which he defines as the corporate HR degeneracy, the state-worshipping legacy media, the captured universities, and woke capital.
Right.
Instead, they must aggressively redirect all their energy, intellect, and resources into building parallel, linear institutions, starting with the uncompromising patriarchal family, extending to tight-knit brotherhoods, and scaling up to entirely parallel economies.
It sounds like he is advocating for the construction of a digital and economic Noah's Ark. You are gathering the remnant of competent builders, securing them inside a watertight structure of logic, biological reality, and self-reliance. And you're essentially letting the legacy institutions drown in the flood of their own ideological contradictions.
That is a highly accurate metaphor for his macroeconomic strategy. But to ensure that this arc remains watertight, Riker introduces a highly controversial principle he calls the syllogism of exclusion.
The syllogism of exclusion. Let's break that syllogism down. How does he justify actively excluding people?
He starts with the premise that high-trust communities require shared objective values and a very low time preference.
Define low time preference.
Low time preference means a focus on long-term building, delayed gratification, and sacrificing today for a better tomorrow. He argues that left-wing actors, by definition, operate on subjective relativism and a high time preference.
Oh, they want it now.
Exactly. They demand immediate emotional validation, immediate equity, and immediate consumption. Therefore, his logical conclusion is that the complete and total exclusion of left-wing actors is a biological and structural necessity for a thriving community.
So to use the arc metaphor, you cannot let them on the boat, because eventually, in the name of equity and deconstruction, they will drill holes in the hull.
Exactly. He's advocating for the creation of what he titles the book after, a dictatorship of truth.
Which sounds incredibly authoritarian to modern ears.
It does. But he defines authoritarianism very differently in this context.
Right, he isn't talking about a military dictator with sunglasses ordering executions.
No, he means an uncompromising institutional enforcement of objective reality, a governance model that strictly prioritizes the rational over the emotional and the natural over the artificial.
So reality is the dictator.
Yes, he envisions communities where biology, physics, and classical logic hold absolute dictatorial power over human feelings. If you feel that you are oppressed by mathematics, the community does not validate your feelings. It demands you adapt to the math.
And he points to areas where this parallel society is already quietly being built, where men are successfully speaking new realities into existence without asking for permission from the legacy state. He looks heavily at the media and health sectors.
Yes. He highlights what he calls the parallel media monastery.
The parallel media monastery.
We're currently seeing massive audience migrations away from legacy television networks and toward platforms like Rumble, X, and long-form decentralized podcasts.
Like what we're doing right now.
Exactly. Riker views this not just as a shift in consumer preference, but as a fundamental philosophical rejection of the legacy media's echo chamber.
Because the legacy media demands conformity.
He argues legacy media demands conformity to Marxist victimhood narratives. These new platforms, however, resurrect John Locke's ideal of the unfiltered free exchange of ideas. They're funded directly by consumers, bypassing the corporate ESG state entirely.
He also points to a rapidly growing parallel health economy. I found this section fascinating. He specifically cites the rise of figures like Dr. Sean Baker and Dr. Paul Saladino, the leaders of the carnivore and animal-based diet movements. Why does a book about Western institutions care about eating stick?
Because Riker frames diet and physical optimization as an act of political rebellion.
Rebellion via diet.
He claims the mainstream medical establishment, what he derisively calls the medical matriarchy, pushes a paradigm of chronic disease management. He argues they push statins, estrogenic highly processed foods, seed oils, and SSRI antidepressants to keep men docile, overweight, and chemically castrated.
Wow.
Therefore, men who reject this paradigm, men who lift heavy weights, optimize their natural testosterone, and eat a red meat heavy diet, are committing an act of treason against a system that requires them to be weak.
So by eating meat and building muscle, they are taking sovereign physical control of their own biology.
Yes.
That brings me to my final overriding question for Riker's entire blueprint. He cites Kant's categorical imperative to argue that red-pilled men have an absolute moral duty to step into the vacuum of power. He says they must act as a vanguard, because if they don't, Western civilization perishes. But logistically, how does a decentralized, disparate group of sovereign architects guys, eating ribeyes, lifting weights, reading Aristotle in the early morning and avoiding dating apps, actually coordinate to replace a monolithic trillion-dollar global governmental state?
That is the crucial vulnerability. It's the ultimate stress test of his blueprint. He relies on the idea that competence naturally aggregates in a crisis.
Okay, what does that mean?
He believes that as the legacy institutions inevitably collapse under the sheer weight of their own incompetence, as the power grids fail, the bridges fall, and the airplanes break because they prioritize diversity over physics society, will enter a state of panic.
And then what?
In that moment of existential crisis, the public will not turn to a diversity bureaucrat for salvation. They will desperately turn to the men who actually know how to build and maintain the aqueducts. His grand strategy relies on building the parallel arc, maintaining absolute competence, and simply being the only viable functioning option left standing when the dust settles.
Wow. We have covered an immense, staggering amount of intellectual ground today.
We really have.
We have traced Conrad Riker's worldview from its deepest philosophical roots, the reassertion of Aristotelian logic, and the law of non-contradiction. We've explored his blistering critique of Immanuel Kant, the Frankfurt School, and modern HR departments.
Yes.
We examine his view of the sexual revolution as a catastrophic severing of eros and logos, and his mathematical breakdown of modern dating apps. And finally, we looked at his psychological demands from men to purge the nice guy syndrome, maintain stoic frame control, and withdraw their consent to build a parallel dictatorship of truth.
It's a sweeping, deeply interconnected ideology that weaves together epistemology, evolutionary biology, corporate bureaucracy, and theology into a single, cohesive worldview.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to reiterate our ground rules one last time. Remember that our goal today was to act as an impartial mirror to Conrad Riker's text. We are not endorsing these political or ideological stances.
Right, we are just the messengers.
But we are providing you, the listener, with a thorough, rigorous understanding of the arguments that are currently electrifying the manosphere and the men's rights movement. You simply cannot understand the modern culture war if you do not understand the profound literature driving it.
And if we step back and connect this entire ideological framework to the broader sweep of history, it leaves us with a truly fascinating paradox to consider.
What's that?
Riker argues beautifully for the necessity of rigid boundaries over fragile barriers. He asserts that true civilization requires patriarchal men imposing rational order on the chaotic void. But he also leans heavily into the Judeo-Christian model of linear history, the idea that history moves continuously forward toward an ultimate truth rather than repeating in endless pagan cycles.
Right, so history isn't a circle, it's an arrow.
Exactly. So this raises an incredibly important question that Riker leaves somewhat unresolved. If history is truly an arrow, what happens if these new parallel patriarchal institutions ultimately succeed? What happens when the sovereign architects win and their arc becomes the new world?
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Do they inevitably become the new mainstream establishment? And if so, how do they prevent the very ossification of evil and institutional decay that Riker claims destroyed our current institutions? If human nature remains constant, does the dictatorship of truth eventually produce its own bloated, self-serving bureaucracy?
That is a brilliant, provocative thought to chew on. You build the perfect, impenetrable fortress of logic. But eventually, decades later, the descendants of the builders get lazy, the administration bloats, and someone starts demanding that you prioritize their feelings over the structural integrity of the fortress wall.
It's the eternal, inescapable challenge of human governance.
It is the ultimate test of any civilization. Well, if this deep dive fascinated you, if the philosophy challenged you, or if it simply made you want to dig deeper into the actual mechanics of these arguments, you need to read the full text. Judge the architecture of the arguments for yourself. Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy your copy of Dictatorship of Truth.
And to keep up with the author's ongoing writings, and to see how he continues to develop these theories in real time, be sure to follow @ConradRiker at Substack.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense intellectual journey today. Please, one last reminder, drop a like on this episode, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you on the next deep dive. Keep questioning the narrative, keep seeking the truth, and keep building.